Pull up the live ocean heat map of the Equatorial Pacific tonight, and you will see a shape that has no business existing this early in the year. A long red bruise stretching along the equator, already glowing more than 2 degrees hotter than it should sit in early August. From a kitchen in Ohio or a porch in Texas, that red smear looks like something happening very far away, in water nobody you know has ever touched. That is the trick heat plays on us. It sits quietly in the middle of an ocean and feels like someone else's problem, right up until the day it becomes a wall of water on your own street. Officially, meteorologists are calling this a developing Super El Niño, but there is an older warning attached to this exact pattern, heat turning into water, and it was not written by a satellite. Decades before anyone could measure ocean temperature from orbit, a blind woman in the mountains of Bulgaria dictated a warning that did not talk about fire, or heat, or drought. She talked about water. Baba Vanga's name gets attached to a lot of vague nonsense online, but this particular warning lines up, almost line for line, with what oceanographers are watching happen on their screens tonight. Before we get to her, though, we need to understand what is actually forming in that ocean, because the mechanism is real, it is measurable, and it explains something that has been bothering you for years without you having the words for it. Here is the story most of us grew up with. El Niño is a natural cycle. It has been happening for thousands of years, long before anyone burned a gallon of oil. Warm water sloshes east across the Pacific every few years. The trade winds falter, the weather gets a little strange for a season, and then everything swings back to normal. Peruvian fishermen noticed it centuries ago and named it for the Christ child, because the warm current often arrived close to Christmas. It was a local curiosity tied to anchovy catches, nothing more. That is the version most weather segments still lean on. A pendulum. A season of odd weather, then a return to the baseline everyone trusts. And there is comfort in that story. If it is just a pendulum, then nothing has actually changed. We can keep building on the coast, keep trusting the seasonal forecast, keep telling ourselves that the heat wave 2 summers ago and the flood last spring were unrelated events, unlucky rolls of an old familiar dice. The pendulum swings, the weather gets loud for a while, and then it goes quiet again. That is what we were told. That is what most of us still believe, more or less, without examining it too closely. The 2 previous events strong enough to earn the label Super El Niño happened in 1997, and again in 2015. Both times, forecasters and news anchors used almost identical language: unusual, historic, temporary. Both times, the ocean eventually cooled back down, the anomaly faded from the charts, and the story quietly closed itself. That pattern, warning, peak, cool down, repeat, is the entire foundation the comforting version of this story is built on. 2 data points spaced roughly 2 decades apart, treated as proof that whatever is happening now will resolve itself the same way it always has. This is exactly the sensation that keeps building for a lot of people watching the news. Every single year gets announced as the hottest on record, or the setup for a super version of some familiar pattern, until the phrase stops meaning anything, and the seasonal forecast you grew up trusting starts to feel like noise. That feeling is not irrational. NOAA's Climate Prediction Center has been tracking sea surface temperatures across the Equatorial Pacific all year, and the number they published is not small. An 81% probability that this El Niño intensifies into what forecasters call a Super El Niño by the end of 2026. The anomaly driving that number is already sitting more than 2 degrees Celsius above where the water should be in early August across an area of ocean larger than the continental United States. The baseline itself has moved, and when the baseline moves, the pendulum does not swing back to where it started. It swings from a different point entirely. But here's where the story actually turns. To understand why 2 degrees of ocean warming matters this much, stop thinking about El Niño as weather and start thinking about it as an engine reaching capacity. For decades, the overwhelming majority of the extra heat trapped by a warming atmosphere did not stay in the air where anyone could feel it directly on their skin. It went into the ocean instead, quietly, year after year. The way pressure builds behind a dam nobody has inspected in half a century. A Super El Niño is not a new kind of storm arriving from nowhere. It is the moment that pressure finds a way out, all at once. There is a specific kind of dread that comes from watching ocean temperature maps update in real time, while forecasters use the words developing Super El Niño, a dread less about the heat itself and more about not knowing what the water is actually going to do to the coastline you live near, or the one your family visits every summer. That specific dread, water as the thing to fear rather than heat, is not new. It has a strange, much older echo. This is where Baba Vanga's warning stops sounding like folklore and starts sounding like an early description of exactly this engine. Her dictations from the 1980s, cataloged by researchers who spent years translating her sessions out of Bulgarian dialect, do not read like typical doomsday prophecy. There is no fire in them, no comet, no war. There is water, coastlines reshaping, regions that had never flooded, flooding, a world where the ocean stops behaving like a background feature of the map and starts acting like the main character. Nostradamus, centuries earlier, wrote in the same direction, in his own tangled language, about waters rising where they had never risen before. Neither of them had a satellite. Neither of them had a formula for how much moisture warm air can hold. What they seemed to have was a sense, however they arrived at it, that heat and water were headed toward the same collision we are now measuring in real time. Here's the part that confuses people, and it confused me for a long time too. You will hear correctly that El Niño tends to increase wind shear over the Atlantic, which can suppress hurricane formation there. So, the safety-minded, comforting logic goes, fewer hurricanes, less danger. Nowhere in that sentence does anyone mention what happens on the other side of the map, or why a quieter hurricane season somehow still ends with entire neighborhoods underwater from a storm that was never even named. Recent atmospheric physics research explains the piece that gets left out. There is a basic thermodynamic relationship established well over a century ago that governs exactly how much moisture warm air can hold. For every single degree Celsius the ocean surface and the air above it warms, the atmosphere's capacity to hold water vapor increases by somewhere between 6 and 7%. That does not sound dramatic until you multiply it across an entire ocean basin, sitting 2 degrees above normal. The sky above the Pacific right now is not just warmer, it is heavier. It is holding an amount of water that has no precedent in the instrument record, and heavy skies do not stay heavy forever. Eventually, all of it comes down, somewhere, all at once. Now, somebody in the comments is already typing this. El Niño is a natural cycle. It has happened for thousands of years. This is all being overhyped. And they are half right. The oscillation itself is ancient and natural. Nobody is disputing that. But global ocean heat content, the total thermal energy stored in the world's seas, is sitting at the highest level ever recorded by modern instruments, stacked on top of a baseline warming of more than 1.2 degrees Celsius that was not there 100 years ago. A natural cycle riding on top of an unnatural amount of stored heat does not behave like the natural cycle your grandparents lived through. You are not looking at the same pendulum. You are looking at a pendulum swinging inside a room that has been slowly filling with gasoline for 50 years, and calling the room normal because the pendulum still looks familiar. Except neither of those two earlier events formed on top of an ocean this warm to begin with. Each successive baseline has climbed a little higher before the next Super El Niño even started forming, the way a tide comes in a few inches higher every cycle, even before the big wave arrives. Compare the starting line, not just the peak, and the story stops looking like a repeat. It starts looking like a ladder. This is exactly the confusion behind one of the questions I hear most often, and it deserves a real answer, not a shrug. Why does the same climate pattern torch one region with heat while drowning another under what used to be called a 100-year flood, sometimes in the same season? The answer is not that the system is malfunctioning randomly. The answer is that heat has to go somewhere, and El Niño decides where. In May of 2024, in the southern Brazilian state of Rio Grande do Sul, rivers that had never left their banks in living memory simply kept rising. Just over 2,300,000 people were affected before the water finally receded. Streets became canals. Families waited on rooftops for boats that could not reach everyone in time. It was not described at the time as an El Niño event. It was described as a freak disaster, a once-in-a-generation catastrophe that happened to hit one unlucky region. It was not luck. Researchers with World Weather Attribution ran the numbers afterward, comparing the world as it actually is against a modeled version of the world without the current level of warming and without this particular El Niño pattern layered on top. What they found was that the strong El Niño teleconnection, combined with record ocean surface heat, amplified the 10-day rainfall total by up to 10% and made a flood of that scale 2 to 5 times more likely to happen at all. 2 to 5 times. Not a coincidence, not bad luck. A measurable fingerprint left in the data by a mechanism that is still active in the ocean tonight. Local reporters described residents tying furniture to porch railings before the water arrived, hoping gravity and rope would keep a lifetime of belongings from floating away entirely. Boats built for lake fishing were repurposed overnight to pull neighbors off second-floor balconies. None of that made it into most of the international coverage, which focused on the 90-second version of the story, dramatic drone footage, then on to the next headline. The 2 to 5 times number is what stayed behind after the cameras left. But here is the detail that should actually worry you more than the flood itself. The Rio Grande do Sul disaster was not an outlier event sitting off in the tail of a bell curve somewhere. It was a preview, because 2 to 5 times more likely does not mean it happened once and probably will not happen again. It means the odds have permanently shifted, and they have shifted toward this becoming the new normal frequency, not the exception. Therefore, when people say extreme weather events keep getting called unprecedented, even though they now seem to happen every single month, they are not exaggerating and they are not imagining it. They are describing, in plain language, exactly what a permanently shifted probability looks like from the inside. The infrastructure that exists in most coastal and river cities right now, the drainage systems, the levees, the storm channels, was engineered using rainfall statistics collected across a century that no longer exists. Every one of those systems is quietly, structurally undersized for the water it is now being asked to move. Picture what that actually looks like from above. Not rain clouds, not a storm system in the shape you learned to draw in school. A river in the sky, a long, narrow corridor of water vapor stretching out over open ocean, invisible to the naked eye but glaringly obvious on infrared satellite imagery, aimed like the nozzle of a hose at a single stretch of coastline. When that corridor makes landfall and hits the first range of hills or mountains, the air is forced upward, it cools, and everything it was carrying comes down at once, concentrated on a strip of land sometimes only a few dozen miles wide. It is not a gentle soaking. It is a targeted release. I will tell you where I got this wrong myself a long time before I understood any of it. When I was a kid in Springfield, Missouri, summer storms used to roll in over the plains almost every August. Sudden, violent, the kind that turned the sky a strange shade of green for 10 minutes. Some years there was too much rain. Other years there was a drought so bad the creek behind our house turned to cracked mud. I remember standing at the window during one of those storms, maybe 8 or 9 years old, genuinely believing that the sky above Missouri had nothing whatsoever to do with any ocean, anywhere. How do I put this? Weather, to me, was something that happened directly overhead and nowhere else. Full stop. It never once occurred to me to ask where all that water had come from, or where the dry years went instead. It took me years of sitting with old newspaper archives, cross-referencing flood dates against ocean temperature records from the other side of the planet before that childhood assumption fell apart completely. The storms over Missouri were never local. They were the last visible link in a chain that started thousands of miles away, in warm water most of us will never see. That is what a teleconnection actually means, stripped of the jargon. It means the ocean and your street are not two separate stories. They are one story, and you are just reading the last page of it. Now, forget the Missouri porch for a second and go back to the ocean, because there is a second skeptical argument worth taking seriously, and dismissing it too quickly would be dishonest. If El Niño increases wind shear and genuinely suppresses Atlantic hurricane development, does that not mean, on balance, that this pattern actually makes water threats smaller, not bigger? Fewer named storms sounds like good news. I understand why that argument feels reassuring, especially if you are exhausted, the way a lot of people are, from living in a constant cycle of preparing for one disaster or recovering from the last one. But fewer named hurricanes is not the same thing as less water. El Niño does not simply turn the danger down, it relocates it. The same shift in wind patterns that makes it harder for an organized hurricane to spin up over the Atlantic also drags the entire jet stream and the Walker circulation, the vast east-west airflow that governs the tropical Pacific, into a different configuration. That reconfigured jet stream is precisely what steers those rivers of vapor towards specific coastlines with far more consistency and far more force than an average year. So the storm count on one side of the ocean can drop, while the water threat on the other side climbs. And both of those things are caused by the exact same mechanism. That is the piece the comforting version of the story leaves out entirely. While parts of Australia and Indonesia bake under an intensified drought as the rain-bearing systems get pulled away from them, the Americas, particularly the western coastline, absorb the atmospheric rivers those same systems redirect. It is not that the danger disappeared. It is that the engine running underneath all of it moved the danger to a different address. Remember that red smear on the ocean map from the very start of this. That is the engine. It does not distribute heat evenly, and it does not distribute water evenly either. It concentrates both in places at times that used to be considered rare. The word forecasters keep reaching for, unprecedented, is starting to lose its meaning because an event only stays unprecedented until it happens for the second time in 5 years, and then a third. Put the pieces next to each other, and the comforting version of the story, the one where this is just a pendulum swinging back to normal, does not survive the comparison. An 81% chance of Super El Niño conditions, a sea surface anomaly of 2 degrees Celsius across an area larger than most continents, a well-established relationship where every additional degree of warming forces the atmosphere to hold 6 to 7% more moisture, a documented finding that this exact combination made a catastrophic flood in Brazil 2 to 5 times more likely, and pushed its intensity up by 10%. None of those 4 things is a theory. None of them is a metaphor. Stacked together, they describe a single, physical, measurable engine, and that engine is running right now, in the same ocean the cameras keep pointing at. And none of the systems we have built to handle water were designed around this version of the ocean. Storm drains sized for the 20th century. Levees rated for floods that used to occur once in 100 years, now arriving on a schedule closer to once or twice in a decade. Coastal drainage systems in cities from Manila to Miami were engineered using rainfall statistics, collected before anyone knew the ocean could hold this much extra heat. Therefore, when a flood exceeds every historical marker in the record books, the honest reaction is not just to be prepared for the next one and hope your section of coastline gets spared. Because the section that gets spared this year most likely will not be the section that gets spared next year. Picture a small port town on a coastline that flooded only rarely for generations, and has now flooded within recent memory more than once. The harbor master there does not need a peer-reviewed paper to tell him something changed. He watches the tide gauge numbers creep higher even on ordinary days, not just storm days. He has started keeping sandbags stacked year-round instead of hauling them out only when a storm is named. That is what a shifted baseline looks like from inside a single ordinary life, long before anyone announces a new probability figure on the evening news. Recalibration, in practice, is a boring word for something urgent. It means going back to the flood zone map for your own address, not the one from when you bought the house or signed the lease, but whatever the most recent revision says, because those maps get quietly redrawn as the data changes. It means noticing whether the storm drain at the end of your street backs up a little more than it used to during an ordinary heavy rain, not just during a named storm. Nobody is going to announce this shift to you personally. The data updates before the warning does. I will be honest about something. When I first laid all 4 of those pieces of evidence next to each other on my desk, my first reaction was not fear. It was something closer to relief, which is a strange thing to feel about a Super El Niño. Relief because for years I had this vague, formless dread every time the news mentioned another unprecedented flood, another record heat wave, without ever explaining why they kept happening in the same years, sometimes the same months. Then, almost immediately after that relief, the actual fear arrived. Heavier and more specific than the vague version had ever been. Understanding the mechanism does not make it less dangerous. It just makes the danger impossible to argue your way out of. There is still a piece of this we have not closed the loop on, and it matters. A Super El Niño does not only mean floods. In some regions, the exact same reshuffling of the jet stream that drowns one coastline starves another of rain entirely, for months, sometimes years. which means the full picture Baba Vanga's warning points toward is not simply water floods things. It is water abandoning some places completely while overwhelming others. The same total volume, redistributed with what looks from the ground, almost like intent. This is the part of her dictations that researchers who catalog them keep circling back to. She did not describe a flood in one place. She described the water itself changing its relationship with the land, everywhere, all at once. Some regions losing it entirely while others were overwhelmed by it. Translators who have gone through the sessions describe her tone shifting when she reached this subject. Less like she was predicting a single storm and more like she was describing a permanent rearrangement of where water belongs on the planet. Whether you take that as prophecy or as an old woman with an unusually sharp intuition for pattern, the description matches what the sea surface temperature charts are showing tonight. Here's the turn most coverage misses entirely. The instinct almost everyone has, myself included for a long time, is to treat a coming Super El Niño as a temporary event to get through. Batten down, wait it out, go back to normal once the anomaly fades. That instinct made sense when the ocean was closer to its old baseline. It does not make sense anymore because there is no old baseline left to return to. Even after this El Niño peaks and eventually weakens, which it will, the underlying ocean heat content that made it possible does not reset to zero. It stays elevated, waiting for the next reversal of the trade winds to hand it back to the atmosphere. Therefore, the honest way to think about a Super El Niño is not as weather. It is as a preview of the default state the planet is drifting toward, delivered early and delivered hard, the way a fever spikes before a body either fights off an infection or does not. Every one of these events is buying us information at a devastating price about exactly how the water is going to behave from here forward. So let's be precise about what has actually been demolished here. The idea that this is simply a natural cycle behaving the way it always has, nothing to see, wait it out, go back to normal, that idea does not survive contact with the 81% probability figure, the 2-degree anomaly, the 6 to 7% moisture law, or the 2 to 5 times multiplier out of Brazil. It was a comforting story. It was never a complete one. Here is the truth underneath all of it, and it is more unsettling than either it's just a normal cycle or an old prophecy predicted the end of the world, because it sits in between those two stories, closer to the science than the mysticism, but carrying the same weight of inevitability the mysticism always warned about. Water was never the backdrop of this planet's climate system. It was always the main mechanism, the medium that actually moves heat around the globe. And we spent the last century treating oceans like scenery instead of machinery. Baba Vanga did not need satellite data to sense that the machinery was speeding up. She only needed to notice, the way people who pay close attention to patterns sometimes do, that water was becoming the thing everything else answered to. That is the real thread connecting everything in this story. The heat wave that will not end, the drought that cracks the soil in one hemisphere, the atmospheric river that turns a highway into a canal in the other, the hurricane season that gets quieter in name only. They are not 4 separate crises competing for your attention on the news. They are 4 expressions of the same redistribution, the same engine, the same ocean, moving water and heat around a planet that built its cities, its farms, and its entire sense of normal around an ocean that no longer behaves the way it used to. Think about how strange it would have sounded 20 years ago to say that a warm patch of ocean near the equator could dictate whether a drought in one hemisphere turns catastrophic, while a river in another hemisphere swallows a city. It would have sounded like a stretch, the kind of connection only a conspiracy chart with string and pushpins could draw. Now it is closer to a routine forecasting exercise. The ocean sets the terms. The rest of the planet's weather spends the next several months negotiating with those terms, region by region, and some regions negotiate very badly. I think about that kid on the porch in Missouri sometimes, watching a summer storm and assuming the sky overhead had no connection to anything beyond the county line. I was not stupid. I was just looking at the wrong map. Most of us still are. The satellites did not discover that water was dangerous. They only confirmed, with numbers and degrees and probabilities, what a blind woman in a mountain village and a handful of fishermen naming a current after a child both already sensed in their own way, centuries apart, using nothing but pattern and attention. So when the ocean maps glow red again this year, and they will, do not wait for the word prophecy to take it seriously. And do not dismiss the word either. Take the mechanism seriously. That is what actually protects you. The water was never a metaphor. It was always the mechanism. And a Super El Niño does not warn us that a storm is coming. It warns us that the storm never really stopped. What that means for you, specifically tonight, is less about panic and more about recalibration. If you live anywhere near a coastline, a river basin, or a floodplain that has never flooded before, that phrase is quickly losing whatever safety it used to imply. The old maps, the ones your insurance company, your city planner, and your own memory all still quietly rely on, were drawn using a version of the ocean that no longer exists. Believing them is not caution. It is nostalgia wearing the costume of caution. I will keep watching these ocean maps the way I used to watch old flood microfilms, one data point at a time, because patterns like this one do not announce themselves loudly. They just keep showing up again and again until enough of us notice. If you have made it this far and this investigation actually rearranged how you think about the water around you, consider hitting subscribe before you go. It is the only reason I get to keep pulling threads like this one out of old archives and new satellite data and putting them next to each other for you. Tell me something in the comments. Do you think the infrastructure in your own city could actually survive what this ocean is about to do? Or do you think we are already past the point where preparing even means anything anymore? I read every answer.